We left off talking about Napoleon and his empire of 1812. By 1812, Napoleon of France, as you know, controls most of Europe. He gains this through his military tactics and maneuvering. He's able to defeat multiple countries that attack him at once, coalitions of armies against him, and there is a lot of luck on his side that causes him to win many of these battles. But by 1812, he's controlling France, the region of Netherlands up there, the German Confederation region here, the Italian region here, and Poland over here. And he ends up putting in power of these regions his relatives. So he has himself he is an emperor and he has an empire. He sets out exactly to do what he wanted to do. And those that are allied to Napoleon, basically Napoleon controls them. Here you have Austria and here you have Prussia. If Austria and Prussia would do anything that Napoleon did not want them to do, he would threaten them with his army. So don't think this is a friendship kind of allies. They're basically forced to do what Napoleon tells them to do. Okay, well, this all comes to an end relatively quickly. And this essential question right here, you can see, how did the most powerful leader, that's Napoleon, of Europe, end up dead on a remote island off the coast of Africa? And in order to answer this, you would look at 234 to 237 in answering that question. Before I talk about his downfall, I want to quickly talk about his marriage. Napoleon was madly in love with a lady named Josephine. Josephine actually cheated on him multiple times, but as she grew older, she did find herself in love with him too. As an emperor, when Napoleon was to die, his son would take over. Problem is, Josephine was not producing any children, so he ends up divorcing Josephine and marries Marie-Louise of Austria. So another female in the high rankings of France is an Austrian. If you remember, Marie Antoinette was from Austria. She is also, Marie-Louise is from Austria. This is a political marriage. The King of Austria said, what better way to become friends with France or to become allied with France, because they were scared out of their mind with Napoleon, than to have my daughter marry Napoleon. Marie-Louise did not at first want to marry Napoleon. She was terrified of it. The king said, I don't want to hear any of that, and sent Marie-Louise off to marry Napoleon. She did eventually fall in love with Napoleon as well. Alright, let's talk about his downfall now. If you look back up at this map, his greatest enemy, and you should remember this, is Britain. Now, if you remember, Britain had a powerful navy, so Napoleon was not, these are my ships, Napoleon was never able to have a men full of ships to come on and invade England. And because of this, Britain was safe from France. But Napoleon wanted to really weaken Britain, and in order to do that, he creates what is called the Continental system. It's basically a blockade. And it's not a visible blockade, it's a blockade by Napoleon. If anyone trades with Britain, I will attack them. It's called the Continental system. Basically, it was to weaken Great Britain, and so they would not be able to trade and be wealthy. So if Russia, which they will, decides to break the Continental system, Napoleon said, you will be attacked for this. The whole point was to make everyone afraid to trade with Britain and to weaken Britain. Well, this basically is the downfall of Napoleon, because he gets involved in two wars that greatly weaken Napoleon because of the Continental system. You have this country here called Portugal, controlled by Britain at the time. They say, we're going to trade with Britain. We're going to keep doing that. We're not going to follow your Continental system. When Napoleon says, okay, I'm going to send in an army to attack you, Portugal, and he has to go through Spain in order to do this, and Spain says, you're not going to go through our country, and Napoleon says, yes, we are. Well, what you have is the Peninsular Wars. And here it is, this is the peninsula, that's why it's called that, and it is a bloody war. It's introducing the whole concept of guerrilla warfare. If you've heard of guerrilla warfare, it gets its origin from this war. You have French soldiers viciously attacking Spanish civilians. They have to attack as Spanish civilians because Spanish civilians end up using guerrilla warfare against Napoleon's troops. You would have a couple guys dressed in normal clothing going up and killing a whole bunch of French soldiers and then running and hiding. So the Napoleon's troops never knew who the enemy was. So as you can see that by this picture by Goya, you can see at this time Napoleon's troops right here taking Spanish citizens. Here's a monk. They're looked at as very innocent. And so the whole point of the painting was to make you believe and make you feel that Spaniards were killed viciously and they were innocent. They did no harm. And you had, but in reality, you had torture on both sides. The Spanish would capture Napoleon's troops and torture him. Napoleon's troops would capture Spanish troops and torture him. One case that they even buried their whole bodies underground, but their heads, and used their heads as bowling pins for bowling. This is nasty stuff. The point is, Napoleon cannot win in Spain with this guerrilla warfare. He's used to fighting in fields with armies, but this is civilians fighting French troops, and this draws out and lasts very long. In fact, Napoleon loses about 300,000 men in this campaign to reach Portugal. He's unsuccessful in doing that. He's unsuccessful in winning the hearts and the minds and the people of Spain. So this war lasts for quite some time. And over here, Russia also refuses to follow the Continental system. At first they said they would, but then they break that. Alexander I ends up refusing to stop selling grain to Britain. And Napoleon says, okay, fine, we'll go to war. And Napoleon ends up creating this grand army, about 420,000 men. It's something that no one has ever seen before, a size of an army like this. And Napoleon thinks he's going to win relatively easy because he was able to defeat Russia before. But he takes his powerful army and he goes into Russia. Russia has an interesting strategy in order to defeat Napoleon, and they're successful with this strategy. It's called the Scorched-Earth policy, and this is where the Russians refuse to fight the British. The Russians refuse to fight the French, and what ends up happening is the Russians would just retreat, and retreat, and as the Russians would retreat, the French were drawn deeper and deeper into Russia. Now, as the Russians would retreat, they would burn everything. So here you can see the French go deeper into Russia. The Russians would keep on retreating. These are the Russians here. And you can see these dots are cities or towns. The Russians would burn the grain, the houses, kill the livestock. So as the French are drawn deeper and deeper into Russia, they start to run out of supplies, and the French are like, come on, fight, stop retreating, fight like a man. Well, they end up reaching Moscow. This is the center of Russia, and Moscow is set on fire. Many people believe by the Russians themselves. The fire was so intense that it was hurricane force winds. Fire needs oxygen. This oxygen is sucked into the fire, causing hurricane force winds. St. Basil, this is part of the Kremlin. This actually was not burned down. Thank goodness, because as you can see how cool it looks like. This is the Kremlin region. But besides this region, everything else in Moscow was burned down. Basically, the point that Alexander I was saying to Napoleon was, we're not going to surrender. We'll burn our own city down before we surrender to you guys. So Napoleon realizes that he can't win because the Russians refuse to surrender. So before winter kicks in, here's Napoleon. You can see the situation is grim. He has his men and he says, we can't do anything, we can't win. So they don't want to stay in Moscow because they'll run out of supplies because everything was burned. So Napoleon retreats back to France. And it gets very, very bad for them, because what ends up happening is his force is destroyed down to 28,000 men. He started out with 422. He ends up with 28,000 men. Why does he lose so many men? Two reasons you need to know. As the Russians retreat back to France, the winter temperatures get so cold that there's an account that says they had to eat horses while they were still alive if they weren't able to get a fire going, because once the horse died, the blood stopped flowing and the meat got solid as a rock. So picture these horses. They would eat the buttocks section first, and the horses are still alive. That's how cold it was. We're talking minus 25 degree temperature. Well, these troops were not fit for minus 25 degree temperature, so they ended up dying, many of them, by disease and by the cold temperature. And that's when the Russians started to attack. The Cossacks, they're called, would attack Napoleon's troops. So he started out with 420,000, and he ends up with about 10,000 troops. This is probably the biggest military blunder in the last 200 years. So here it is. There, Napoleon is done. He ends up abdicating. He says, "I'm done. I lost. I can see that everyone is against me now." If you remember, as Napoleon's troops were retreating out of Russia, Austria and Prussia were allies. They say, "We're not allies anymore. We're going to turn against you." So it's kind of interesting that the King of Austria, Napoleon, is his son-in-law, and Austria turns against France. Prussia turns against France. Napoleon flees. Interesting thing happening here. King Louis the 18th. It's not King Louis the 16th's son. It's another relative. He is put into power by the victors that defeated Napoleon. And Napoleon is sent to a small island called Elba, which is located right here. That's Elba. A couple months go by. Napoleon ends up escaping out of Elba and ends up coming into France. The troops that were sent to kill Napoleon or capture Napoleon by King Louis XVI end up joining Napoleon. King Louis I'm sorry, not King Louis XVI. King Louis XVIII that sent the troops ends up fleeing, and Napoleon is back in power. And Austria and Prussia and Britain are like, "Oh my gosh, we got to do all this over again." And yes, they got to do it all over again. But Napoleon only lasts for 100 days. Strike that, 100 days, not 100 years. And he's defeated at the Battle of Waterloo. And what ends up happening is Duke Wellington of Britain, you can see the British flag, ends up defeating Napoleon along with his coalition of other troops from Prussia, and Napoleon is again captured. This time he's sent to a small remote island off the coast of Africa called St. Helena. Two ships were constantly patrolling around the island to make sure that Napoleon could not escape. It's so far from Europe it would be impossible. He lasts for 20 years as an emperor, and he ends up dying, many believe, of stomach cancer in 1821. His body is then sent to Paris, and there is his tomb. You can still see his tomb today. That is the answer to the question. Again, big problems following the Continental system. Russia and Portugal refused to stop trading with Britain. That ends up being a downfall because he's unable to. He loses so many men in Spain, and he loses so many men in Russia, and he's ultimately sent to St. Helena. And his legacy and his empire is done, and he dies in 1821.